This video wouldn't fly without Squarespace. On May 1st of 1982, British bombers took off on a daring mission halfway across the globe. But this was no ordinary bomber, and this was no ordinary mission. The massive 170-ton Delta Wing bomber, built to carry nuclear weapons and act as a final line of defense against the Soviet Union, was flying an active combat mission, all while sounding like this. This marvel of engineering kept Britain safe 24/7 at the peak of the Cold War with its nuclear retaliatory capabilities, and would perform the missions impossible for any other British aircraft. And it was going to bring in a new generation of British engineering marvels, from a supersonic passenger version to even a flying carrier version with mini fighter jets to take on Soviet bombers. This is Britain's final line of defense, the OG Delta Wing bomber, the Avro Vulcan. The end of World War II showed the world the devastating power of nuclear weapons. The USSR developed their own nukes in 1949, and one thing became clear: if you considered yourself a world superpower, you better have a nuclear weapon to back that claim, otherwise you could be wiped out. And this fact became apparent to the third major winner of World War II, the United Kingdom. They decided to develop nuclear weapons of their own, but since their budget was limited compared to the US and the USSR, they had to do it in a clever way, and this will be the theme throughout today's video. So what exactly was their idea? Well, the Ministry of Supply came up with specification B3546, which they sent to various UK aircraft companies. The specification stated the need for a medium-range bomber capable of carrying one 10,000-pound bomb to a target 1,500 nautical miles away, from a base which may be anywhere in the world. The requirements were, well, pretty wild. This bomber would have to have a cruising speed of 500 knots, which is 580 miles per hour, at altitudes between 35 to 50,000 feet, which is already difficult to achieve for a bomber in the 1950s. But when you add in the fact that the maximum weight loaded was to be below 100,000 pounds, or 45 tons, well, you got yourself a challenge, especially hitting that weight requirement. At Avro, they quickly realized that conventional aircraft would struggle to go below that, so they put two of their best up for the job. The dream team would be Technical Director Roy Chadwick and Chief Designer Stuart Davies, and these two would start working on a technological wonder. After shopping around all the different wing concepts and taking in all of the requirements, they decided that they were going to go for a tailless Delta Wing design, which was not that out of the box, keeping in mind that Northrop had already tried this with the YB-35 and the later 49 to create a flying wing bomber. But the Brits would try to solve all of the issues with this previous aircraft and have one enter service, unlike the Northrop prototypes. Chadwick was already well known at that point and had been designing planes for Avro for decades. They looked at the design of Alexander Lippisch, who designed the similar configured aircraft during World War II, and figured that such an approach could save a ton of weight. But a common misconception is that they simply copied his design. This is a gross oversimplification of the process involved. The development of our hero took a lot of innovative work, and it involved smaller prototypes and the designers and engineers getting incredibly sidetracked. Let's go over the absolute bonkers evolution of the Vulcan. The Vulcan was an incredible aircraft, something that the world had not seen before, and was an innovative solution for Britain to bring the edge against the Russians and compete with the Americans to deliver nuclear weapons in case of war. And it's this type of philosophy that you need to bring to your own life and business, looking for innovative solutions to get the edge on your competition. And it's that exact reason that I use Squarespace to power my own merch store at www.foundandexplained.shop. That's right, with Squarespace's AI-powered blueprint builder, I was able to launch a professional, sleek website with just a few easy steps with no coding or design experience. They have award-winning templates and easy to drag and drop editing to make it effortless to have a brand that looks first class. And just like air traffic control guiding planes to their destinations, Squarespace's built-in SEO tools help visitors to land on my site with optimized meta descriptions, automatic site maps, and much more. So whether you're launching your own brand or selling aviation gear like me, Squarespace makes it simple, stylish, and stress-free. And best of all, I can knock 10% off your first site and domain at www.squarespace.com/found. So jump onto Squarespace, build a site, make some money, and support the channel. Originally, the team was set on making it a delta wing bomber, but once they started coming up with the designs, they quickly realized that swept wings would make the large aircraft more stable. So they removed the tail and turned this aircraft into a flying wing, called the Avro 698. Fuel was carried in the leading edge fuel tanks, and each wing had a large bomb bay, and the engines were placed one behind the other. This thing looked promising, and Avro could potentially win the contract with it. But then in 1947, disaster struck when Roy Chadwick was killed whilst on a test flight of the Avro Tudor II. This was a major issue, and they had to figure out how to push the project forward without their visionary. The government was interested, as they thought the design had potential, but they changed plans a bit and came up with a fail-safe strategy to ensure that they would end up with a bomber at the end of the program. They let Avro have a go with the 698 as the first primary design, but they also gave more conventional, lower requirement projects to Short Brothers and Vickers, which resulted in them building the SA-4 and the Type 660 respectively. That way, even if Avro failed with their crazy new bomber design, they would still have something. Work would continue into the next year, and this is where things would get more complicated. And yeah, I mean more complicated than your lead designer getting killed. First off, Avro built 2 prototypes and changed their design somewhat. The engines were again placed in pairs, but now next to each other, and there was one weapon bay. They also extended the fuselage. But this is where they came across a problem. You see, all this time, Avro had actually no idea how to build a flyable delta wing aircraft, and they had no idea what would actually happen to these prototypes when they took to the skies. So both they and the Ministry of Supply agreed that they would have to create an aircraft that was 1/3 of the size to test its flight model. The ministry came up with another specification called the E-1548, and Sir William Farron, who succeeded Chadwick, set out to build some prototypes for it. The first one was called the Avro 707 and was built in 1949. The design was simple and easy to produce, and this is what they needed for testing. Remember, this aircraft was being built parallel to the 698, not before it, so they had 2 projects at once. And this would be the reason for yet another tragedy. Since the aircraft wasn't that fast, regulations said that no ejection seat would be needed. So Avro was just like, yeah, no need for it, let's just get this thing into the air. But handling wasn't all that good, and the test pilot Samuel Eric Essler lost control and crashed, which resulted in his death. They would later build another 707A, but the sad part is the 698's development was going rather well, and the engineers were figuring out things on their own, even without all the data from the 707, so they didn't really learn anything new from this parallel project, meaning in the most brutal way possible, the test pilot died in vain. However, the B version is much more interesting. It had an ejection seat, as well as a redesigned cockpit and controls that would give much better handling. Test pilot Rolly R.J. Falk tested in 1950, and he said he absolutely loved it. So he immediately told his bosses what to change and perfect the design. He even wanted to display the prototype at the Farnborough Air Show, which was really nice, except this is the sidetrack part that I talked about earlier. There wasn't really a need for this aircraft at all because the original idea behind the prototypes was to explore general handling. But Avro scientists kept looking into how to make this smaller version even better. So they came up with a third version called the 707C, which was much closer to the final 698 version that was supposed to be, but just downscaled. It had a larger cockpit than the other 707s as it featured side-by-side seats. So now Avro had two different aircraft programs that were merging into the same aircraft. And ultimately, the 698 was chosen to progress forward mostly on its own, and there was no need to continue working on the 707s. However, I do need to point out that Avro did gain a lot of interesting test data when it came to the handling of a large delta wing aircraft, which led to some minor changes of the 698 program integrating 707 concepts. But I'll get to this later. As for the 698 itself, the first prototypes were fitted with Rolls-Royce RA3 engines, but this was just to get it airborne as they wanted to get it flying before the competition and prove, yes, that this concept is going to work and much better than those rival conventional designs. The maiden flight was again performed by Avro Vulcan on August 30th, 1952, and it worked well, except for the parts where the parts of the undercarriage fell off the plane. But since these weren't critical, it landed without a problem. They kept working on the plane and eventually showed it off at the Farnborough Air Show in 1952, where it flew with the other two 707 prototypes. And in 1953, you can actually see a formation of two 698s and four 707-2As, Bs in the sea. The only thing left was to pick a name for this aircraft, and Chief of Air Staff Sir John Slessor stepped in and said, "I want the name to start with a V." So in the end, they settled on the name Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and destruction. Very fitting. So let's take a look and see what makes this plane so darn cool. To speed along development, Avro decided to turn the two prototypes into actual production versions of the aircraft. They would call the first one the B1, and they would use the second prototype to help develop its upgrade. The B1 would get the Bristol Olympus 101 engines, a H-2S Mark 9 radar, and a Mark 1 flight computer. Space age for its time. Remember, this is the 1950s, where computers were generally the size of a building. This B1 version could fly at 56,000 feet and at 620 miles per hour. Requirements? Check. Parts of the airframe were composed of a light alloy honeycomb structure to reduce the weight even further, and it got two large air brakes to slow it down when landing. And inside the cockpit, they decided to give it a well-arranged layout with stick controls, like on a jet fighter. It would feature a crew of 5 with 2 pilots, 2 navigators, and an air electronics officer to run that big computer. Although there was a safety issue as well. While the pilots could eject, the rest of the crew could not, and leaving the plane for them was impractical and dangerous. Talk about work position entitlement. And with the B1 bomber in their hands, the Ministry of Supply gave it the green light. Immediately upon receiving the production version of the B1, the Brits started flying them all over the world. This was to show support to their allies and parade the ingenuity of British engineering. And remember, this wasn't a bomber like the B-2 Spirit that you would keep in secret. They wanted to show it off so the Soviets would know that they had a nuclear deterrent of their own, like having a big "Beware of the Dog" sign in your front gate. But development didn't stop there. In 1956, a decision was made to further improve the bomber. It would be able to fly at greater heights, and it could be refueled, extending its operational range. Since the Soviets improved their air defenses, the Brits added electronic countermeasures and the ability to carry 2 blue steel standoff missiles so it could defend itself. They also changed the wing and improved control surfaces, and of course, added the new Olympus 200 series engines. But what made the Vulcan so interesting was the infamous howl. Remember that the Stuka siren from World War II and the psychological horror that it would inflict upon the enemy? Well, the Vulcan had its howl. The howl, unlike the Stuka siren, wasn't an intentional feature, but a play of aerodynamics and design. It was actually unique to the 200 series airframes and was created due to the air intake design, where a certain engine power, namely between 85 and 97%, and an around 100 kg of air entering the intake at a certain angle would create this thundering roar. The sound created really puts chills into the bones, and if you know what comes next, you will be running for your life. And this bomber would use its roar and its actual implied threat to protect the UK for years, and they were serious about it. 4 bombers would carry the nukes and would always be ready on the runway. The pilots would wear ventilated suits, flying overalls, G clothing, and they would wear it all day and basically sleep in it, which was pretty damn uncomfortable. In case of a nuclear strike, the Vulcan would take off from a cold start in only 1 minute and 40 seconds, which is crazy even by today's standards. Ironically, if it really did take off to bomb the Soviets, it wouldn't have had anywhere to return to, as the strike would more than likely wipe out their home airbase in retaliation. But wait, why were they so sure that the Soviet air defenses wouldn't shoot them down? Well, this is where the experience gained in those 707s came into play. The Vulcan was very maneuverable for its size, and the idea was for it to fly very, very low to avoid detection, under 250 feet to be exact. They would use this new technique called flick bombing. The pilot would make a 90-degree climb at the point of release, and the inertia would actually flip the bomb towards the target. And in training, it was proven that this would work. So yes, this plane was pretty amazing, but there were also downsides, and the main one was safety. The first tragic crash occurred when the first B1 Vulcan was delivered and crashed in Heathrow in 1956, killing the whole crew. In total, between 1956 and 1968, the RAF would lose a staggering 16 bombers in flight, claiming 71 lives. But the Vulcan thankfully never had to drop any nukes, and it wasn't really used in any combat missions during this time. It was involved in some recon at sea, but that was mostly it. And looking at the platform into the 70s, the engineers started to suggest some pretty creative new variants. Avro was reported to have considered a civilian version of the Vulcan as inevitable as early as 1954, and it insisted that with an initial order of at least 25 aircraft, it would commence commercial production, carrying around 100 passengers in an aircraft called the Avro Atlantic. This would also lead to a military troop version with a capacity of 70 troops to get them to the front lines, plus a supersonic engine version to make it faster, perhaps even to rival the Concorde. And there was a proposed third generation in the works called the Vulcan B1 that would carry 6 missiles under its wings, and it would be used as a missile patrol aircraft with an extended fuselage to carry 6 crew members. But this last version has to be my favorite. This one wouldn't carry missiles, but 3 Nant fighters slung underneath the wings. The Nants would have been able to release in enemy airspace to provide fighter cover for the bomber, and they were expected to land in friendly territory or return to the Vulcan to replenish their tanks by means of a specially installed flight refueling dongle. But there was also a rumor that these Nants would be armed with small nuclear weapons, in effect being a manned cruise missile. The pilots had 2 options: bail out before the plane hit the target, or actually ride it in like Major Kong in Dr. Strangelove. But none of these designs would eventuate, and by the start of the 1980s, much to the disappointment of the pilots, a decision was made to retire the Vulcans as they were getting quite old. But there were some other countries interested in the type. Australia was considering it, but they were swayed by their new American friends to secure the F111 instead, something that the British reluctantly allowed in the case of diplomacy. But then there was also another little country in South America that wanted the aircraft as well: Argentina. They asked for a single plane to test it for its market, with the British saying, well, yes, that we can make that happen, but they were uneasy. The hair on the back of their necks was standing up. And then when it came to doing a large sale of the Avro Vulcan to them, the aircraft that would be perfect for a strike mission, say to some small islands off the coast of Argentina, they said no. And then, just like clockwork, 3 months later, the Falklands War began. In April of 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. They started using Port Stanley Airport to launch their own planes and disrupt the assault of the British Navy. The airfield needed to be bombed so that no more jets could take off, but here was the problem. Port Stanley was the only airfield in the area, and the second closest place a bomber would be able to take off from was located on the Ascension Islands, which is, here. This meant that a round trip would be 7,600 miles. Naturally, the only bomber that the British had at the time that could perform this feat was the advanced B-2 Vulcans, using their aerial refueling capabilities. But you see, using a 30-year-old plane to perform such a daunting task does come with its problems. First of all, the probes of the refueling systems were old, and all of these rubber seals and couplings had dried up, meaning that the Victor tanker tried refueling them during a practice run, they would get fuel splashed on the front windscreen, and there was a significant risk of fire. They rectified the issue eventually, but the plane was still old and not reliable as before. And this was an especially insane idea to fly it for that long. Imagining finding your dad's 30-year-old car in the garage and saying, yeah, this thing could totally make for that dream road trip across the continent. The distance of Port Stanley also meant that there would have to be 5 total refuels and the entire run would take 16 hours. Brave pilots weren't deterred, however, and despite the fact that the Vulcans barely held together and the fact that they had no direct air support, they took off into the sky into what became known as the Black Buck Raids. The first mission took place on the 1st of May in 1982, and despite all odds, it was a huge success. The Vulcan did manage to hit the airfield and leave a crater on the runway, preventing fast enemy jets from taking off. And out of 7 raids, 5 were performed successfully, although on raid 6 the probe broke, so the Vulcan had to land in Brazil as it ran out of fuel. And these raids helped elevate the Vulcan into the mythical status that it has today. And despite the fact that it's a relic of the past now, one still flies, namely the B2 variant under the serial number XH558, where you can see it at many airshows. The Vulcan really pushed the realm of what was possible and was a technological wonder for its time. It paved the way for crazy and deadly bombers today. It should not be forgotten as a sort of sideways pre-evolution of the B2 and the B21 radar. Thanks so much for watching, and please leave a comment on what you would like to see next in the next Found and Explained video.